Hello and welcome to this webinar on the basics of sexuality education in autism. My name is Louise Southern with the Autism Society of North Carolina, and I'm happy to be with you here today. The main objectives for this webinar are to review the core features of autism spectrum disorder that must inform how we address this topic of sexuality education. I'm also going to talk about some of the key areas of focus within this topic and provide examples of ways to break down these areas into teachable segments. And I'm going to offer some best practices and as well as resources and curricula for teaching skills and concepts related to sexuality education. This is a mammoth topic, and I want to say right out of the gate that I obtained a lot of input in the development of this webinar. I obtained input from self-advocates. I obtained input from parents and caregivers and other professionals on this webinar. So let's get right to it. First and foremost, as we approach this topic of sexuality education, it's important to consider some of the general best practices in sexuality ed. So first and foremost, we have to educate ourselves. We need to work to be knowledgeable and comfortable as parents, as caregivers, and as professionals about the basics of sexuality education and understand the primary terminology and concepts that will help in explaining these basics to others. For many of us, we need to work to be more comfortable with using the terminology. And it's critical that when we consider this broad topic of sexuality education, that we are first and foremost not talking about sexual intercourse. So lots of us have had those very uncomfortable sort of one and done talks with maybe our parents back in the day, where the talk was about sexual intercourse or reproduction or protection. But by the time many of those conversations happened, many had already heard lots about sex from their peers. And in many cases, and in those cases, perhaps parents were late to the game. But on the other hand, these talks are so much more comfortable for everyone, parents and children, when they're conducted beginning at a very early age, when the questions naturally arise in some young children. And then the aim is to try to keep that door open as much as possible, keep that door of dialogue open as much as we can. And to take natural opportunities to continue the dialogue over time as issues become more complex. I know it's not easy. As a parent of 3 boys myself, that's what we've worked hard to do, is just to keep that door of dialogue open and to find those opportunities to bring this up in ways that are natural and easy. And in the long run, it's making it a lot more comfortable for all of us to be able to address some of these issues that inevitably will come up. Another general best practice in the field of sexuality education and puberty education, in addition to educating ourselves and in addition to those early and age and developmentally appropriate dialogues instead of the one and done talks, is of course just to keep it simple. Keep the information simple and explain it in small and meaningful chunks, paired with opportunities for the child or for the adolescent to ask questions that they may have about the information that you provide. And when we have these ongoing dialogues with our children as best we can, it allows for us to follow this guideline of keeping it simple and presenting the information in segments or in stages, rather than a great big one and done talk where we try to cover everything all at once, which is basically impossible to do. So it's important, again, that our understanding of these general best practices guide the way we approach sexuality education in autism intervention as well. It's also really critical that as professionals, those of us who are professionals working with families, that we, of course, need to be very sensitive to the experiences and values and beliefs that in part comprise cultural identity and have a huge influence on how the broad topic of sexuality education is viewed by the families we support. We have to keep this at the forefront in all of our interventions. And it's important to note, too, that sexuality is a part of every individual's life, including individuals with disabilities. For decades, people with intellectual and or developmental disabilities have been thought, for example, to be asexual or to be eternal children, having no need for loving and fulfilling relationships with others. Furthermore, some people with intellectual or developmental disabilities frequently lack access to appropriate sex education in schools and in other settings. And at the same time, some individuals may engage in sexual activity as a result of poor options or as a result of manipulation or loneliness, or as a result of exploitation or physical force, rather than as an expression of their sexuality. And we know that any type of disability appears to contribute to a higher risk of victimization, but it's important to note that in particular, folks with communication disorders and behavioral disorders and intellectual disabilities appear to be at the greatest or highest levels of risk. For example, we know recently in January of 2018, the National Public Radio obtained unpublished Justice Department data on sex crimes. And the results of those data show that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, both men and women, were the victims of sexual assault and exploitation at rates 7 times more often than those people without disabilities. And so this is really important for us to keep this in mind, that we're working in many cases with a vulnerable population. And so arming them with the information and the concepts and skills that they need to more successfully navigate this very challenging realm of sexuality education, it's critical that we try to do that work in a proactive way. And in keeping with this idea, there's a couple quotes that I found to be particularly poignant. So one by Griffiths from a study that they produced back in 1999, sexuality education should be proactive, as most learners with a developmental disability receive sexuality education only after having engaged in sexual behavior that is considered inappropriate or offensive or potentially dangerous. And this reactive approach, where we're kind of working to just put fires out rather than having a proactive approach to sexuality education, Peter Gerhardt compared that to that this may be considered somewhat akin to closing the barn door after the horse has run. And so again, this idea of being proactive, I hope, is already rising to the surface as one of our mantras, as one of our key guidelines as we move forward in addressing this topic of sexuality education. And in addition to our recognition of general best practices in sexuality education, and in addition to the fact that we need to assure that our interventions as professionals are culturally responsive and value those distinct and unique cultural differences and values and beliefs of the families and individuals we are supporting, it's also critical that our understanding of the autism core features must also inform the way we address sexuality education. Of course, we know that many people with autism need concrete information, context-specific and experience-based instruction in order for that instruction to be meaningful. And as we consider some of the problems that we see related to this topic, when there are fires to put out, for example, it's so important that our strategies and our interventions are responsive to these core differences. Clearly, status quo sex education is typically not sufficient for many. And so one of these core areas, and I'm just going to spend a few moments reviewing some of the core characteristics or core features of autism that we need to take into account as we're designing our educational approach for folks with autism. So for example, we know that many with autism appear to display specific interests in parts of objects or in parts of situations rather than seeing the whole. So for some with autism, they may have overfocus on the details, and they may struggle to generalize concepts and skills learned under one condition to other conditions, or they may struggle to connect the dots, or they may focus on the trees rather than the forest, for example. And so we know, for example, when I think about this issue that we see with some folks with autism who struggle to generalize concepts learned under one condition to other conditions, just take, for example, the skill of or the concept of maintaining personal space. And so for many folks, we might teach them one arm's length distance. So we might hold our arm out and teach them, okay, you stand this far apart from someone else when you're communicating with them. And we can practice that and role play that and support them in understanding how to adhere to that rule and the reasons why it's important to adhere to that rule. But if we only address the concept of personal space in that situation where we're standing and we're holding our arms out to show that arm's length distance apart from another person, that individual with autism, some individuals with autism may struggle to generalize that concept to other situations where the concept of personal space is also relevant. So for example, when you sit down at a table and there's a bunch of empty seats and there's one person sitting at the table, In most cases, you might not sit down right next to them unless you're a very good friend or family member, for example, or a close colleague. But unless we teach that rule and teach the behaviors that accompany that rule and concept, some people with autism may not follow that rule because they may not know it. Another example, and I've learned this from, of course, many male colleagues and having 3 boys myself, the idea that when a man enters a bathroom, the unspoken or hidden expectation is that if there's one guy standing at one urinal, the idea is that a guy should try to go as far away from that man as he possibly can to use the urinal. So there again is that rule about personal space, that unless we explicitly teach it, we can't expect for some individuals with autism to generalize the rule they learned under one condition to other conditions. So it's important for us to keep this in mind as it pertains to sexuality education, is that for many, we're going to have to explicitly and concretely address the many different conditions, many different examples that will help that person with autism to connect the dots more effectively and to see the concepts and to see the forest rather than just seeing the trees. As it pertains to core features of autism, we know that for some with autism struggle with the nuances or the hidden messages that others send and receive when they interact with one another in social situations. Some with autism struggle with abstract social concepts and abstract social information. And this also impacts some individuals' ability to take on the perspective of another person. It may be difficult for some with autism to assume the perspective of another person or to put themselves into someone else's shoes. And this could cause someone with autism to misunderstand another person's message or the intent of their message. Or one with autism might struggle to know how someone else is thinking or feeling in a given situation or what they are planning. And of course, I want to say too that these core differences are not unique exclusively to autism, but it's just important to know that for some with autism, these are sort of hallmark challenges that we see. Or some with autism may struggle with the concept that we think about other people as we interact with them, and that our thoughts about people change based on their behavior. So imagine how this complicates the already supremely complicated world of, for example, preteen and teen relationships. So it's critical that we think about the topic of sexuality education, that there are huge, huge overlaps with social skills and social thinking and social understanding, social interpretation and perspective taking that go into developing healthy sexual relationships or healthy relationships in whatever form those relationships take. And so this hidden curriculum is something that's so important for us to often have to make explicit or to unpack and to clarify concretely and explicitly for some with autism. The hidden curriculum is made up of all the social guidelines that everyone, quote unquote, everyone knows, but no one is directly taught. And we often learn this hidden curriculum through observational learning, where we pick up on what's accepted and what's not accepted by watching facial expressions and by watching interactions and body language and by watching and observing the reactions and outcomes of certain social behaviors. But for some with autism, it can be difficult for them to learn through that form of naturalistic observation, in which direct, explicit instruction doesn't accompany it. And so, for example, the hidden curriculum, I shouldn't have to tell you, but it should be obvious that, or everyone knows, or no one ever had to teach that. For example, I shouldn't have to tell you, this is a private behavior. This is a private topic. A pretty explicit but relevant example of this that I've in fact encountered in working with some students with autism at the high school level is, I shouldn't have to tell you this, but this is a private behavior. You don't masturbate, for example, in your school bathroom. You're only supposed to do that if you're going to do that in your home, in private space of your home bedroom or your home bathroom. But for some individuals with autism and others, that can be a concept that unless someone explicitly addresses, they may not know that rule to be true. Or it should be obvious that, for example, we don't ask strangers or coworkers particular questions, private, personal questions. Or everyone knows that, if he says or she says, I'll call you, and then they don't for a number of days, that probably just means they're not that into you. So these are some of the examples of the hidden curriculum. Information and rules that unless we explicitly address and teach, some individuals with autism may not get. For this example here, many of us have learned the social rule in the dominant US culture that you try to look towards people when they're talking to you. But here's the catch. If you look too long, then they're going to think you're staring. Then you're going to think you're weird and creepy. So it's also these rules, and then it's the nuances within these rules about how long to look and when to stop looking, for example. So again, imagine how this has so much, how this is so relevant in the topic of sexuality education when we're thinking about developing social relationships, developing healthy relationships, whether those are friendships or other kinds of relationships. Again, our understanding of the autism core features has to inform our response. And so when we think about beyond the issues of generalizing skills and concepts that some individuals may struggle with, or beyond the issues of social perspective taking and reading and understanding and following the hidden cues and the hidden social rules that some individuals with autism may struggle to follow and understand, we also have to keep in mind that many individuals with autism might display a restricted range of preferred activities, or might hyper focus on certain activities or materials or routines or topics. And so, for example, sexual behaviors like, for example, masturbation in inappropriate public settings, or early forms of masturbation in inappropriate public settings that some individuals might display, may become one of those core focused activities as well. And for those with autism who often seek out or may seek out sensory input and may do so excessively, and for those who might seek it out in ways that are not as socially expected, we can see how this only compounds the issue further. And so when someone doesn't have a wide range of interests and activities, it may be more likely that they would revert to the activities that produce good feelings. And then this takes us back to the issue of understanding social rules and conventions that govern how we behave. Rules about where we do certain things and what we do. And then, of course, we also know that some individuals with autism may struggle to control impulses or to stop and think before acting. Again, this is not just unique to autism. I want to make that very clear. But we do know that for some individuals with autism, they may struggle with impulse control. They may struggle to stop and consider the implications of their actions, the social implications, or in some cases, the legal consequences of their behaviors. And then finally, and in some ways, this is most important, I think, it's critical to note that many individuals with autism might struggle to initiate communication and to self-advocate in a variety of situations. Of course, there are some individuals with autism who have very limited ways to convey even basic wants and needs, like where to go, where they want to go, or what they want to do. Others with autism, of course, may be fully conversational in their language. They may still struggle to initiate communication or to self-advocate in certain situations, particularly socially demanding situations that are complex and overwhelming. And again, this is not unique to autism. Many teenagers and others struggle to self-advocate in ways that are healthy and appropriate. And we know this can be a real challenge for some with autism. And central to this issue and how it intersects with the topic of sexuality education is the idea that everyone across the spectrum needs a way to say what they want and what they don't want. And when we think about sexuality education, some of those key underpinnings include self-advocacy and self-esteem, having a strong self-concept and an empowered voice. And we know that this is where many individuals with autism may struggle, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum. So again, this is a critical area of focus that we have to take into account when we're addressing sexuality education, and recognizing that some with autism, of course, have very limited ways to convey what they want and also what they don't want. And even those who have lots of language and are highly conversational, they may still struggle with advanced forms of self-advocacy in those most complex and socially demanding situations. And so this is a big takeaway point that I hope many will remember, is that sexuality education starts long before puberty. And it intersects with these major areas of self-advocacy and safety. And it intersects with the area of social skills and social understanding and healthy relationships. and understanding what comprises a healthy relationship. How do I know if I'm in a healthy relationship? What kind of people should I be seeking out to have a variety of different relationships with? Friendships, colleague, work relationships, sexual relationships, whatever kind of relationship we're talking about. What does a healthy relationship involve? These are critical topics that we have to also consider as we're addressing sexuality education in autism. And so these are some of the major areas to iteratively address across the developmental continuum. And when I say iteratively, because I'm saying that because we're going to have to return to these topics again and again. The goal is that we'll have here is to find the right starting point along this large continuum of topics and issues that might be addressed. And what we address, of course, will certainly be different depending on the individual's level of understanding and other factors. And this critical point is that with each of these topics, we're not just going to address them at one point or one stage and then move on from them forever, but rather consider how for typically developing children and teens and adults, and of course then for individuals with autism too, we're going to return to these topics over time with increasing complexity as the individual has more context and as they mature. So for example, take the broad area of safe and healthy relationships versus unsafe and unhealthy relationships. This starts very early on. This topic is addressed very early on as we support preschoolers and elementary age children in understanding how to make and keep friends, about who is a friend and who is not a friend, how to be a friend to someone else. And then this topic of healthy and safe relationships evolves over time and becomes more complex. So again, my point here is that we're not just going to check each one of these topics off and then quote unquote master it out or move on from it. These are going to be returned to over and over again over time with increasing complexity and increasing context. And so some of the key, these basic intervention guidelines that I hope you'll see as we walk through each of these case studies that I'm going to present is to try to be proactive and to start early. This is critical whenever we can and in whatever ways we can. That's a key important guideline for us to remember. Another intervention guideline, be very concrete and very clear. And I hope the examples I'm going to provide offer that to you. I'm going to also show the ways in which we might use visual supports to support instruction across the autism spectrum, to promote understanding of and adherence to certain rules, to help break down complex concepts, for example. And also another key intervention guideline, when there is a problem behavior or a fire to put out, unfortunately, the idea is that we don't just want to think about what's the behavior we're getting rid of or what's the behavior we're trying to reduce, but most importantly, what are we teaching and reinforcing instead? What's the alternative behaviors that we can teach and reinforce that will help this person to still get those same needs met, but in ways that are safer or more expected? That's the aim. So I'm going to walk you through 3 case examples, sort of across different age points and roughly across the autism spectrum. And of course, these are just 3 examples. So here's the first one. Devin is a 6-year-old boy with basic functional language who is served in a K2 or kindergarten through 2nd grade classroom for students with autism. At times, he seeks out social attention and sensory input by sitting on people's laps, by laying his head on laps and seeking big, deep pressure hugs. He does this with family members, but he also does this with teachers, with parents, friends, and neighbors, and other less familiar people. And in a few recent episodes, he's approached total strangers and sought out these hugs. So basically, we've got a young child with autism who likes to snuggle and is also seeking out social attention and, of course, social interaction, and also seeking out that sensory input that he so clearly needs. But what we need to address is the fact that while it's okay for him to do this with close family members, it's obviously not okay for him to do that with people outside of his immediate family circle. And it puts him at great risk. It makes him more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. And we want to keep him safe and help him to understand that his body is his own and that there are certain boundaries that we have to adhere to as we're interacting with different people that fall into different levels of that social circle. So it's for his own safety that we need to address this skill or this issue. Of course, we need to consider these core features of Devin's autism. Again, the sensory needs. We have to find ways to address those sensory needs. That's a huge, huge factor in any intervention such as this. We also have to take into account the fact that Devin has limited, functional language. So the information that we convey to him and the way we're supporting him in understanding information, it's going to have to be age appropriate and aligned with his level of understanding. So this is a list of the primary strategies that we want to take into account as we're addressing this for Devin. And there's a hugely important one that I left off of this list. And I can't believe I did that. But so right out of the gate, I want to say that one of the most important bullets that's missing from this list is we need to take into account those sensory needs, as I said. So Devin seeks out sensory input. He seeks out deep pressure. He seeks out those hugs and those squeezes. And so we want to make sure that when it's not okay for Devin to do that with other people, that he's still getting those needs met. So obviously we're going to want to consult with an occupational therapist who can help us to figure out ways for him to get all of his sensory needs met. That's going to be a crucial consideration. He still needs to get those needs met. It's just that we want to make sure he's doing it in more safe and expected ways. And so he's not going up to strangers and seeking out that sensory input, which would not be safe or expected for him to do. So I want to make that clear that that's kind of consideration number one. And then there's some other strategies here, and I'm going to walk you through each of these. So without further ado, for Devin, given his young age, we want to support him in, of course, being able to label his own body parts and recognize and name his body parts using technical, accurate terminology. That's a best practice in general sexuality education, and it's very important for us to support Devin in doing this as well. Secondly, it's going to be important for us to help Devin understand the rules that govern what we're trying to teach. And so for him, we might develop a simple, concrete social story or social narrative that explains these rules. So here's an example. And this is actually a pretty complex social story. And so I want to say right out of the gate that for many folks with autism, we might need to simplify this further. And of course, we'd want to consider the ways to individually tailor this to meet Devin's level of understanding and to help him to pique his interest in this social story. So we might include photos and illustrations, for example. Maybe we're going to use Google Images to personalize and support his comprehension. Instead of it all being on 1 or 2 pages, we might format this social story across multiple pages. There's a wide variety of different ways to format social stories in ways that will support comprehension and will support the individual with autism in being interested in the social story. But essentially what a social narrative is it's a written explanation, and it's often accompanied with images and other or photos or icons. It's a story that explains to the individual with autism what this situation or behavior is and what's a more appropriate or expected way for that individual to get those same needs met. It's intended to explain certain social rules that govern what's expected and what is not. So it's not meant to be punitive. It's not meant to emphasize the don'ts, but it's rather intended, or it should be written in ways that emphasize what Devin should do instead. And so here's the basic social narrative. I like getting hugs. And this is written from Devin's perspective, or the idea is that we're trying to write it from Devin's perspective, and then we're going to read it to Devin. I like getting hugs. I also like getting snuggles. Hugs and snuggles feel good to me. Hugs and snuggles are okay to do with some people. I can hug my mom. I can hug my dad. I can hug my brother. I can hug grandma and grandpop. These people are in my family. I can hug and snuggle people in my family. And as you might imagine, these are parts where we might include photographs of these people in Devin's family. If we can, we would include photos of Devin hugging each of these people in his family to make it even more concrete and clear to Devin what this narrative is explaining. Here's page 2 of the narrative. But other people are not in my family. My teachers and neighbors are not in my family. Strangers are not in my family. I cannot hug and snuggle people who are not in my family. Instead, I can give them high fives. Hugs and snuggles are only for people in my family. I will try to follow the hugs and snuggles rules. And obviously, this is just one way to write the narrative. Instead of high fives, it might be more appropriate to just say, I'll wave at the person, or I'll say hi to the person, or I'll give them a fist bump. So obviously, it's going to have to be tailored to meet that individual's specific situation and what the family and that individual values and what's important to them in the ways that they're going to describe how Devin should interact with people who are not in his family. And again, you can imagine here how we would likely need photos or images to support Devin in understanding some examples. Maybe using pictures of stores when he's going into stores, and like pictures of grocery clerks or the Walmart greeters, or pictures of his teachers or pictures of neighbors outside to convey to him, these are the people who are not in my family. And then obviously we want to include in this narrative maybe an image of him giving a high five or waving or giving the fist bump or saying hi instead of giving the hugs or snuggles. So again, we want to use images to support Devin's understanding here. It's also really important for me to say that social narratives or social stories are just one piece of the puzzle or one intervention strategy within a toolbox of strategies that we often need to use. And it's also important to note that with the social story, you don't just read this to Devin once and then expect him to follow it and adhere to it, but rather this social narrative or this social story would be something that we would review with Devin over time repeatedly, and particularly maybe just before going into the store, maybe just before going to school each day. And when he gets to school, the teachers are reviewing this social narrative with him as well to help remind him of the expectations. So back to this list of strategies. So far, I've said that we might need to develop a social narrative for Devin. I've also said that we need to support him in accurately and technically labeling his own body parts. This is important. We also, of course, want to address those core sensory needs that Devin has. So he has ways to get those needs met. Another thing we're going to want to try to do is remind him of the rules, and maybe using a simple rule card or other visual support before he encounters people in the community. So in addition to that social narrative that's a bit longer, that's more like a story that we read to Devin and with Devin, this might be a simple, quick visual cue or quote unquote rule card, if we want to call it that we could use to show Devin and remind him of what the expectations are just before he goes into situations where he's likely to encounter people who are not in his family, to remind him of the rules. There's a wide variety of social narratives that specifically address this topic of my body is private, getting at the idea of my body is my own. There's a lot of examples of social narratives out there in the world of autism intervention and in disability intervention more broadly. So I encourage you to Google search and just check some of those out if you're looking for ways to convey this information to a particular individual with autism. Here's another example of a social narrative that might be appropriate for someone like Devin. And let's say in this example that Devin is really into space, themes of space and astronauts, loves to read and talk about outer space. And so given those specific areas of interest that Devin has, we can fold those areas of interest into the social narrative itself. And this is what we might call a power card strategy, where we're thematically or visually integrating areas of interest into the social narrative to try to get that buy-in from Devin. So this reads, Captain Moonbeamer's rocket ship is very small, and it is hard not to get close to people sometimes. But he always tries to follow the personal space rules and not be a space invader. He will stay at least 1 arm's length distance away from other people. This makes all of the astronauts happy, and he wants Devin to always try to do this too. So this is just another example of a way you might convey information to a particular child who has this area of interest of space and the themes of astronauts. And if that's an interest of his, we might find ways to fold that as we're trying to teach the rules of personal space and boundaries. So in addition to these strategies that I've addressed so far, there's some other critical considerations of obviously one of the things we have to do is teach him alternative ways to make social contact with those outside of the immediate family circle. So again, we have to decide, are we going to teach him to wave? Are we going to teach him to give high fives? Are we going to support him in doing fist bumps? Maybe it's going to be the combination of all those three. Obviously, we want to support him in using as many socially appropriate and integrated responses as he can. as long as they kind of adhere to these social boundaries about what's expected and what's not. And then it's going to be really important for us to also inform those other key players of the rules and strategies so that we can get them on board. So for example, we need his teachers to be on board with what we're trying to address so that they're not continuing to allow him to climb onto their laps, for example, and snuggle. We're trying to support them in following those same rules of personal space as well. Or we're supporting the grocery store clerk who he's very familiar with maybe, and we go to the grocery store twice a week and he knows the person, and yet we maybe need to talk to the grocery store clerk about the fact that we're trying to teach Devin the rules of personal space. And so we want that person to also support us and go for the high fives and to not go for the hugs. And then obviously, as we're teaching this skill, this is going to involve modeling and prompting and practice, and then prompt fading and over time. So we're helping Devin to perform the expected behavior in these early opportunities, but then obviously over time, we're trying to fade out that support so that Devin is doing it more independently without our reminders, without our prompting. That's a critical thing for us to keep in mind and for us to support the whole team in understanding. When we do see Devin trying to go for the deep hugs or the snuggles with people outside of his immediate family, it's just important that we want to non-emotionally and calmly interrupt that behavior as best we can, to kind of get in the middle of it, to block it, and then to prompt him to display the more appropriate form of social contact instead. So we want to make sure we're giving him ways to still interact and to get some of those needs met. We just want to support him in doing it in a more appropriate way. So we're teaching him to do this instead of that. And obviously, we want to give him lots of positive praise and natural social feedback when Devin is demonstrating the appropriate responses of the waves or the high fives or the fist bumps or whatever. So this is sort of the basic set of strategies. Again, it's usually going to involve more than this, but I would say that as we're thinking about the initial things to do in a case like Devin's, these are some of the things that we're going to want to consider first and foremost. Giving him a way to understand what are the rules that govern these behaviors. Why should he do this instead of that? We want to make sure he understands the why. That's going to be important. We want to make sure we're teaching a pro-social and expected behavior that can replace the less expected and less safe behavior of him snuggling and trying to hug people who are not in his immediate family. We want to obviously address those core sensory needs that he has. He needs ways to get those sensory needs met. He's seeking out deep pressure and hugs, and so we want to make sure we're finding alternative ways, alternative methods for him to more safely get those needs met. And obviously, we want to make sure we're supporting Devin in being able to accurately and technically label his own body parts. It's important for him to be able to do this, given his age. So here's another case, a brief case example. So this is Kevin. Kevin is a 12-year-old boy with no vocal language who is served in a classroom for students with autism. And in recent months, he's started masturbating in public settings like the bus, the school bus, classroom, in the home common areas like the living room, the kitchen. This started out in pre-adolescence as groin pressing and rubbing up against pillows and furniture. But Kevin tends to engage in these behaviors, obviously, to obtain sensory input. In other words, the behavior feels good. And anecdotal reports and also suggest that Kevin is more likely to engage in this behavior during downtime, or when he's otherwise unengaged, or maybe when he's bored, or in those less structured periods, whether he's sitting on the bus with nothing else to do, he's sitting in the car with nothing else to do, he's sitting in the classroom during downtime, for example, or he's hanging out at home and he's not otherwise engaged. This is when this behavior is more likely to occur. Now, obviously, we need to, of course, first and foremost, consider those core features of Kevin's autism that should inform how we respond to this. Kevin has limited language, so I'm going to show you some strategies that explicitly address getting at this need that he has to be able to advocate and express his needs. Kevin obviously has sensory needs, which is very typical and normal given his age. We want to support him in finding more appropriate ways to get those needs met. Kevin also has limited understanding of the social rules that govern where and when I can do certain things. So we're going to want to try to support him as best we can in understanding and adhering to those rules. These are some of the key features of his autism that we have to take into account as we're providing an intervention that's appropriate, that's culturally responsive for Kevin, that's responsive to his autism as well. So for Kevin, this is the primary list of strategies that we came up with. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's likely more to it than this. There almost always is, but these are some of the key things that we need to think about first and foremost. So I'm going to talk you through each of these. So when he starts to exhibit this behavior of masturbation in a public context, let's say we're at home, the family is at home with him when this happens, this would be the appropriate time to maybe pair a private time visual cue or a picture that represents the concept of private time and the place where private time can happen with opportunities for him to engage in it. So in that situation, maybe, for example, mom or dad, when they see him engaging in this behavior, they're going to try to quickly interrupt and redirect him to a private space, so to his own bedroom. And they're going to show him this visual cue that represents private time, where he can then go into his room and engage in this behavior. So we're trying to teach the concept of private and where can this behavior happen. And this is not a concept that we're going to teach overnight. It may be very difficult to teach, but it's a concept that we're going to try to address for Kevin. We're going to try to clarify private spaces are your bedroom or your bathroom. Anywhere else is generally the public domain where you can't engage in masturbation. And in addition to that, the family might have to place boundaries around private time. Maybe they're going to embed it into his visual schedule. And so you can see here an example of a visual schedule. Visual schedule, of course, as many of you all know, conveys a basic sequence of what's going to happen and in what order across the day or across a particular chunk of the day. Visual schedules have to be individually tailored to the level that is appropriate for that particular individual with autism. But in this example or this case study, Kevin's visual schedule shows a basic block of the day, and it shows what's going to happen and in what order, so he can predict and so he can better understand what's going to happen. Gives him a better sense of power and control over his day. The idea, obviously, is that Kevin has many opportunities to exert choices about what's going to happen and in what order. And we want to support Kevin in putting together this sequence himself whenever possible. And so the reason that this visual schedule is relevant to this topic of sexuality education for Kevin is that we might want to include private time in his visual schedule so that he can see, when am I going to get to access that private time that he needs and wants. By being able to see it in his visual schedule, it might clarify for him when he can have it versus when he cannot. And it gives him a greater sense of predictability. So it's not just that it's unavailable to him all the time, but it's a way for him to see that, yes, it can be available to you, but there's a time and a particular place where it can happen. So the visual schedule becomes important in this intervention process. Here's the private time visual cue that you can see here in the middle of the screen. And this might be what is represented in his visual schedule. It's what the parents might also show to Kevin when he's starting to engage in masturbation within his own home, and they are redirecting him to the private space of his bedroom, and then, of course, leaving him in there to engage in private time, but they're trying to teach him the concept of what private time means, and they're pairing it with that moment where he's engaging in that form of masturbation in the public house setting. So this is complex, and it's hard to talk about this in a webinar because I can't read the social cues and the facial expressions of those to whom I'm speaking right now. But sometimes these are the uncomfortable topics that we have to address. Obviously, keeping that individual with autism at the forefront. What are their needs, and how can we support them in getting those needs met in ways that are safer and more expected or more appropriate? I also should have said right out of the gate, as we're thinking about this case study for Kevin, that if I'm the professional coming in to support the family and to support Kevin in addressing this issue, I have to obviously follow the cues and follow those values and beliefs of the family. And so first and foremost, in some cases, it's going to involve a lot of, maybe some uncomfortable discussion with the family about what are they okay with. And so we have to, as professionals, obviously, we've got to get on the same page with the family about what they're comfortable with, what they're okay with. And we can't expect them to align with our beliefs and values, but rather we're going to have to work within their system, within their belief system, and within their value system. So as we move forward with Kevin, we've got a visual cue that represents private time for him. We're trying to embed that into his visual schedule. We're also trying to pair that visual cue with the moment of private time. So we're trying to teach him that concept of what it means and where it can happen. And then for Kevin, we might also develop a basic social story or social narrative, a modified social narrative that conveys the rules in a much more condensed form. If you remember Devin's social story or social narrative, it was a lot longer. It was more involved. For Kevin, it needs to be more simple. It needs to be concrete and clear as we can make it. So in this example, after school, I can have private time in my bedroom. And hands and pants can only happen in my bathroom or my bedroom. And so this might be the visual rule card that we subtly and privately try to show Kevin when he's at school, teachers reminding him of where this can happen, what are the rules, and when can he access private time. This is going to be something that we might have to review with him a number of times to support understanding. And then another key consideration for someone like Kevin who has no vocal language is obviously, and this goes far beyond this particular issue that we're seeing with Kevin, but more broadly into the wide domain of self-advocacy. How does Kevin get his needs met? How does Kevin convey what he wants and what he doesn't want across a variety of contexts, across a variety of different situations? How does he request anything and everything? And so obviously we need to support Kevin in getting those requests honored and heard. We need to empower him with a voice in whatever form that voice is going to come. And for Kevin, it may also be important for us to teach him a way to request private time. Obviously, there's going to be a time and a place for private time. He's not going to be able, if he makes the request for private time at school, for example, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to honor that request in the school setting. But we want to empower him with a way to have his voice be heard. And so for some with autism, this is going to be a critical consideration. How does he make that request? Or how does he clarify, I need a break? How does he clarify, I want to go to my room for a little while? How does he say that? And so whether we're teaching him to use a modified sign to convey this, whether we're teaching him through the use of another augmentative communication tool, whether that's through picture exchange or whether it's through a tablet device, whatever way we're teaching him to communicate, it's going to be important for Kevin to have an appropriate way to self-advocate around a wide variety of needs. And it's also going to be important in this set of intervention strategies for Kevin is that we consider using a preference assessment to identify additional activities that he can do to keep himself busy on the bus, for example, or at school during downtime, or at home during downtime, that can maintain his focus and that are enjoyable to Kevin. And obviously in conjunction with this idea is that we want to try to limit unstructured downtime whenever we can. I know this is way easier said than done, particularly if we're thinking about at home with the family. It's pretty difficult to keep someone engaged all of the time. Obviously, the family has other things that they need to do as well. But if we're seeing that this behavior is happening when there's nothing else for Kevin to do, obviously the idea is that whenever we can, we're trying to fill his time with meaningful and enjoyable activities, keeping him busy. So for the bus ride, for example, we might develop a basic visual support, such as this one, that clarifies for Kevin, when you're on the school bus, here are some things you can do. So this serves as a visual reminder cue. It might be what the bus driver or the cab driver is presenting and reminding Kevin of each day. I can play with my iPad. I can hold my cards, my Pokemon cards, or I can squeeze my putty. So this is that visual reminder that clarifies what can he do instead. And then for Kevin or for some individual with autism, it might be important to have a busy box. And a busy box might contain a variety of different interesting and motivating materials that the individual can engage in. And we want to rotate those materials out on a regular basis to keep it fresh, to keep it interesting, so that he doesn't get bored with what's in the box. The idea is just to try to keep him engaged in meaningful and enjoyable activities so that he may be less likely to engage in masturbation in situations where it's not expected or safe or appropriate to do so. And of course, this is going to be true for the whole the whole team, the family, the school-based team, whoever's supporting and working with Kevin, is we want to try to non-emotionally interrupt and redirect to an alternative activity. And so what I mean by that is, yes, if let's say that Kevin is in a public setting and he begins to engage in putting his hands down his pants and engaging in masturbation behavior, kind of the natural response is going to be to quickly react, and maybe to strongly react. But we want to make sure we're staying calm and cool, even in that high pressure situation. We want to try to keep it positive, and we want to try to just calmly redirect Kevin to what he's supposed to be doing instead in that moment. Maybe we're also going to remind him using his visual schedule of when he can access private time. That private time will happen later, but we can't do it right now. And we're, again, focusing on what he can do. So rather than the don'ts, the stops, the no's, what is Kevin supposed to be doing? That's what we want to emphasize in these moments. Obviously, when we're supporting Kevin and he's engaged in appropriate behaviors, like let's say, or expected behaviors on the school bus, obviously, I hope that we're able to give him lots of positive praise and feedback as he's engaging in expected behaviors on the school bus, or when he's at home, or when he's in those downtime periods at school. So making sure that we're acknowledging him and acknowledging those expected behaviors as much as possible is critical. And then last but not least, given that this behavior is happening at school, given that it's happening on the school bus, given that's also happening at home and in other settings, it's really important that the whole team be on the same page and there's really good collaboration between home and school. And then I would say in this particular case that this should be folded into a school-based behavior intervention plan, that we're all thinking about the ways that we can support Kevin, preventing this behavior from happening, reinforcing alternative behaviors, clarifying for him when this behavior is okay for it to happen, and just taking all these intervention strategies into account and folding them into a school-based behavior plan, I would argue is really, really important in this case. And then last but not least, the last brief case example that I wanted to address is Anna. And Anna is a fairly independent 15-year-old girl with advanced verbal language who spends most of her day in the general education classroom. She's recently become very interested in having a boyfriend. And at times, she makes unexpected and perhaps unwanted overtures towards male peers at school. And she's also using social media platforms to try to find a boyfriend. At times, though, her texts and posts are unexpected or inappropriate. Some peers bully her by manipulating her into using sexual slang in the classroom, even though she does not always understand the meaning of that slang. And despite her many skills and strengths, she's also naive to the complex rules and codes that govern how one should behave. And so for Anna, we've got to think about Anna's autism and some of those core features of her autism that must inform our response to these issues. We need to keep in mind at the forefront, of course, that Anna needs very good ways to self-advocate. Anna needs ways to understand and for us to support her in understanding what comprises a healthy relationship. How do I know if someone is a friend or not? How do I know when someone is not being a friend to me? There's a lot that's going to go into this. And when we think about Anna's autism, we're thinking about social skills and social thinking, social perspective taking, and self-advocacy. These are some of the critical areas that we have to consider as we're addressing this. And so for Anna, given this particular case that I described, there's a number of prerequisite concepts and skills that we're going to need to support Anna in better understanding. And these concepts and skills that can hopefully lead to a happier and healthier and safer relationships with others. So for one concept and skill that we want to make sure that we're addressing for Anna is saying no. We need to make sure she has an empowered voice. When is it okay for Anna to say no to a peer? When is it okay for her to say no to an authority figure? We want to make sure we're addressing these situations in which she should say no and she should feel empowered to do so. Concepts such as my body is my own. That's going to be a really important concept for us to address with Anna. And that doesn't only pertain to like physical interactions with others, but it also pertains to the world of cyberspace and online interactions. Her body is her own. Pictures of herself are her own. Those are private. And so supporting her in recognizing and understanding that. Who is a friend? Who is not a friend? This is a huge topic, but it's one that we have to chip away at and support Anna in understanding. And so when we think about defining for Anna what comprises a friend, this is not easy to do. But for Anna, given her autism, given what we know about her autism, there's some things we're going to want to clarify for her. For example, a friend is someone who calls you back and texts you back when you text them. A friend is someone who talks to you and spends lots of time with you in school. They sit with you at lunch, for example, on some or most days. They hang out with you during breaks at school on some or most days. A friend is someone who you spend time with outside of the school day. So by no means do those brief bullet points I've just given you constitute what a friend is in full. But the idea is to try to begin to give Anna some basic criteria for what is a friend and who is not a friend. How do I know if someone cares about me? What are some of the behaviors? What are some of the signs? How can we support Anna in being a social detective so we can support her in better understanding and recognizing when does someone have ulterior motives that are not in her best interest? And another key concept that we're going to have to support Anna in understanding is, what will others think of me if I say or do or post certain things or certain images? These are some of the prerequisite concepts and skills. So how do we address these? Again, this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. These are some of the strategies, some of the primary strategies that we're going to want to use to support Anna in unpacking these very heavy concepts. We might use role play scenarios and social narratives, playing the social detective. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail. So role play scenarios. For example, for someone like Anna, we might set up a variety of different scenarios that become increasingly complex and difficult to figure out how to navigate. And we're supporting her in breaking these scenarios down and thinking about what would she do, what would she say, and then supporting her in understanding that in some of these scenarios, she might be thinking one thing, but the other person in the scenario might not be thinking the same thing. Their plan and their intention might be very different from hers. And this is the kind of stuff we have to help Anna to unpack and to understand and to realize. So a boy from your class tells you that his friend wants to be your boyfriend. He wants to kiss you. This boy tells you to walk over to the basketball court and go get your kiss. So this is just one example of a scenario maybe written for someone like Anna. This is taking into account the fact that Anna is quite naive and perhaps vulnerable to being manipulated in this situation. And so we're trying to support Anna and recognize that maybe this boy is not telling the truth, for one. Maybe the other boy doesn't actually want to kiss her. Maybe the boy's plan is that she'll go over there and make a fool of herself so that they can laugh at her. That might be their plan. And so we want to support Anna in recognizing that there may be that she might think the plan in his mind is this, but he may have a different plan. So we're trying to support her in being more socially savvy. Or another example, you've texted your friend twice and it's been 2 days and you've gotten no response. What is he thinking or feeling? How do you know? And so again, just supporting her and considering that what she thinks he might be thinking and feeling may in fact not match on to what he is actually thinking and feeling. So role play scenarios and breaking these scenarios down is one critical strategy that we might need to use for Anna. Another strategy that we want to consider here, and it intersects with the first one of role play scenarios, is playing social detective. And we can do this through the analysis of role play scenarios and written scenarios, but we can also do this with Anna through the analysis of still photos, through video clips where the audio is turned off. And so she's having to use her eyes to be the social detective and to try to discern and understand, what is another person thinking or feeling? What might they be thinking? What's something else that's different than that they could also be thinking? Just helping her to recognize that there could be this thought in his mind, but he also could be thinking this, something very different. And so we can support her in playing social detective, starting with still photos. of social situations, and then working our way up to analyzing video where there is no audio and she's having to watch the videos and to play social detective in those situations. And then in live interactions, in live role play scenarios, supporting her in unpacking and playing the social detective in those situations. Other strategies that are going to become very critical, I think, for Anna are going to be to use graphic organizers. And graphic organizers come in a wide variety of forms. Over the next few slides, you're going to see a range of examples of graphic organizers. And what graphic organizers do as it pertains to social behaviors is we might use T-charts or behavior maps or 5-point scales, for example. These are all visual systems that can help a person to organize their behavior or their thinking. It can help them to better visualize and to thereby conceptualize more complex issues or decisions or ideas. It can also help them to map out the outcomes of their behavior. So they come in a wide variety of forms, but they're often critical when we're supporting a learner like Anna in understanding and unpacking these very complex social concepts. So here's a basic example. Let's say that Anna is really into Star Wars. She loves the themes surrounding Star Wars. And so we might use a basic T-chart as one strategy, where we're conveying on the left side of this T-chart, here are some of the things that you can post, pictures you can post that are okay to post in public. On this other side of the T-chart, on the right side, these pictures are not okay for the public sphere. And so we're supporting her in being able to sort those two in kind of very black and white terms. And we're using her thematic area of interest of Star Wars to help promote a little bit more interest and buy-in, and to help her see this a little bit more clearly. There's a variety of different graphic organizers produced by a number of folks out there. For example, the incredible 5-point scale, which I'm sure many of you all are familiar with. The authors of the incredible 5-point scale have also developed several other publications, one of which is the Social Behavior and Self-Management Guidebook. And it's a 5-point scale intended for adolescents and adults. There's also another publication that they've produced, which is called A 5 is Against the Law. And that concretely supports some in understanding that some behaviors that fall along a scale, moving up towards that 4 and 5 level, can actually get you arrested. They're illegal. And so supporting folks in individuals with autism and understanding that in some situations, we can organize behaviors and thoughts and feelings along a scale. So it's not always just this or that or black and white. Here's another nice example of a graphic organizer. This was developed by the Organization for Autism Research, and this is intended to convey different levels of behaviors and where these different behaviors can happen. And so it's intended to define and organize private spaces versus semi-private spaces versus semi-public spaces versus public spaces. And it's to delineate boundaries around what behaviors can happen in each of these spaces. And so it's intended to, again, to support the individual with autism and understanding sort of that there's a gradient, there's a scale involved here. And this can be really important for someone like Anna, maybe, to understand. And so we can organize a number of different behaviors along these kinds of scales or using these kinds of visual organizational tools. I think the point here with these graphic organizers that I didn't say yet is that just simply relying on verbal explanation is often not sufficient for many individuals with autism. We often need to make these concepts visual. And so that's what many of these graphic organizers can help to achieve. We also are going to have to support Anna in visually depicting what other people might actually think when she says or does something versus what she assumes they might be thinking. So here's another example of a basic graphic organizer or a visual support that's intended to support her in mapping out and anticipating outcomes. So if she posts this particular picture, let's say it's a picture of her, like a sexy photo of her that really she should not post. If she posts this picture, here's what she wishes other people will think about her. And so this is where we're sitting down with Anna and we're supporting her in filling this in. But then on the other side of this chart, if she does post that picture, here's what other people might actually think about her. And so we're supporting her in realizing that what she wishes and hopes people think may not actually map on to what some of them will actually think and feel about her. It's to get at that issue of perspective taking. It's to get at the issue of anticipating outcomes and recognizing that my thoughts and feelings about a particular situation might be different from somebody else's thoughts and feelings about that same situation. Obviously, for Anna, another key thing we have to build into this set of strategies is she needs a trusted adult to whom she can confide and consult. And I've used this strategy with a number of individuals. When verbal back and forth or dialogue is too stressful or too demanding, for example, we might consider for Anna using a safe questions journal where if talking is too hard, where she's writing questions or writing describing certain situations or scenarios, and her trusted adult is responding in that safe platform of using that safe questions journal when talking is too hard. That can really open up the dialogue in a way that's more comfortable for some. Again, not just specific to autism. I can think of many adolescents for whom that might be a more appropriate way to engage in that safe dialogue. And so for Anna, obviously, there's a number of routines that we're going to want to make sure she knows what to do when these things happen. For example, what do I do if my period comes unexpectedly? Who do I tell if a private body part is touched or shown by someone else in a way that makes me feel uncomfortable? Or what do I do if I receive a strange or sexy message or post or picture? Or what do I do if I'm asked to send a strange or sexy message, post, or picture? So for Anna, we want to make sure that we're building into this, what's going to be the plan? What's her action plan? What is she going to do? And who is she going to tell? Who's going to be her trusted adult to whom she can confide when these kinds of things happen, to support and give her guidance without judgment, to give her and to also support her in being a social interpreter for her and helping her to unpack and be a social detective in these situations. That's going to be critical, that we're proactively, before things hit the fan, or rather when there's already a fire to put out, we want to address these things before any of that happens, proactively with Anna. And so in using these basic case studies with Devin and Kevin and Anna, at the end of the day, I hope that we're walking away with some basic strategy guidelines. First and foremost, wherever we can, to try to be as proactive as we can and to start as early as we can in addressing some of these issues and topics that fall under the umbrella of sexuality education. I hope you've also seen in these examples that I've tried to provide that we need to be as concrete and clear as we can. And whenever possible, that we use visual supports. And visual supports are relevant across the autism spectrum. And again, I would say that when it comes to sexuality education, visual supports become highly relevant, autism or not. But using visual supports is of course critical when we're supporting individuals with autism and understanding expected behaviors, rules that govern behavior. So it's critical for us to consider the ways in which we can use visuals across the spectrum to address this topic. And underlying all of this is that when we're supporting individuals with autism in addressing the topic of sexuality education, that we're changing our communication in order to support their understanding. That's critical here. At the end of the day, I think my biggest, hopefully my biggest takeaway slide here is that sexuality education is not just about sex. These issues and these broad topics and outcomes are related to self-advocacy, social skills and social understanding, and healthy relationships. They are so integrally related to this topic of sexuality education. We cannot address sexuality education adequately unless we are also taking into consideration the way in which it intersects with these critical domains. I've also offered a variety at the end of this webinar, a variety of teaching resources that I would encourage you to explore and consider. There's a lot of publications here that are very helpful. I've used almost all of these at some point in my career. I've also used several of these as the parent of 3 boys, and have found them to be very helpful in that regard as well. So I encourage you to check out some of these teaching resources. Here's the second page of that list. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are so many great resources out there. And this, thank goodness, that in the field of sexuality education in autism intervention, we are seeing a growing body of curricula out there and resources to address this issue. We've got a long way to go in the area of research, but there is a small but growing body of research on this topic. There's also some great online resources that I would encourage you to check out here. For example, one, Sex Ed for Self Advocates, is a series of recorded webinars offered by the Organization of Autism Research. These are all free webinars that I would encourage you to check out. There's a lot of great resources out there, and these are just a few of those. I just want to remind you, of course, and this is always true with the Autism Society of North Carolina, that first and foremost, we are here to support you. Our wonderful autism resource specialists are all parents of individuals with autism themselves, and they are really at the front lines when you are in need of support, whether it pertains to this topic or any issue in the realm of autism. We encourage you to reach out to the Autism Society of North Carolina and tap into this amazing resource of our autism resource specialists. They are parents and they understand first and foremost what it is like to be the parent of an individual with autism. So I encourage you to reach out to them. They are positioned to support every county in North Carolina. We also have a wide variety of webinars out there, in addition to this one on sexuality education, that I encourage you to check out. We've also got a growing collection of social narratives that we have developed on a variety of topics to support families and individuals as well as professionals in developing and using these social narratives to support an individual with autism. And thank you so much for your time today. I encourage you, if you have questions or feedback for me on this webinar, I welcome your questions. I welcome your feedback. My email, again, my name is Louise Southern, and my email is lsouthern, SOUTHERN, at autismsociety-nc.org. My email is also on the front of the presentation, the very first slide. Thank you all so much for participating in this webinar. I know I'm just skimming the surface here with this topic, but I hope that this was helpful in giving you a few additional strategies and considerations. Thank you.